The day David almost gave up. It started with a silence David had never known before. Not the kind of silence you notice when a room is empty, but the kind that echoes even in a crowd. The kind that follows you into bed and clings to you in the morning. The kind of silence that doesn't just come from the outside, but from the absence of something within. David wasn't always like this. There was a time when he believed with every fiber of his being that he had been chosen for something great. A time when he would sing to God in the fields, harp in hand, heart ablaze, before the crown, before the betrayal, before the wilderness. He was just a shepherd then, the youngest of 8 sons, the overlooked one. Yet when the prophet Samuel came searching for a king among Jesse's sons, it was David who was called from the field, anointed with oil, marked by God, a destiny declared. But destiny, as David would learn, doesn't unfold in a straight line. It was years later now. The oil had dried, the songs had quieted. Saul, the king he once served, now hunted him like prey. David was no longer a boy with a harp, but a fugitive hiding in caves, surviving on borrowed food and fading hope. He had been promised a throne, but all he had were scars. On that day, the day David almost gave up, he was in the wilderness of Ziklag. He had returned from battle to find his camp burned to the ground, his wives taken, his men in mourning. These weren't just soldiers, they were his brothers, his loyal ones. And now, in their pain, they turned on him. They spoke of stoning him. It wasn't just the smoke from the ashes that stung David's eyes. It was the betrayal, the heartbreak, the question that throbbed louder than the cries of loss. God, where are you now? This wasn't how the story was supposed to go. This wasn't the path the prophet described. David had risked his life to serve God. He had walked in obedience. He had spared Saul when he could have taken vengeance. He had waited, prayed, trusted, and now, it all seemed meaningless. But then, something shifted. Not in the world around him. The camp was still in ruin. The men were still grieving. But David did something that many of us forget to do when life is at its worst. Scripture says, "But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God." He didn't find strength in his men. They had turned on him. He didn't find strength in his circumstances. They were in shambles. He didn't find strength in a guarantee of tomorrow. There wasn't one. He found strength in God alone. In that moment, he remembered who had called him, who had seen him when no one else did, who had anointed him when he was only a boy tending sheep. He remembered the lion, the bear, Goliath. He remembered that God had never failed him, even when the path was painful. So David did what only a leader with a heart after God would do. He called for the priest. He asked for the ephod. And he inquired of the Lord, "Shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them?" And God answered, not with silence, but with clarity. "Pursue them. You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue." And so David rose. He gathered what remained. He led his weary men into battle. And he recovered everything, his family, their possessions, their dignity. What would have happened if David had given up that day? What if he had let the silence consume him? What if he had believed the lie that God was no longer with him? We might never have read his Psalms. He might never have become king. Israel might have lost its greatest leader. Sometimes the most pivotal moments in our lives don't look like victory. They look like collapse, like silence, like everyone walking away. But it's in those very moments, when everything screams, "Quit," that heaven leans in, waiting to see if we'll do what David did, strengthen ourselves in the Lord, and keep going. Before we continue this story, if it's speaking to your heart, if you've ever had your own Ziklag moment, I invite you to pause and support this channel. Your like, comment, share, or subscription helps us keep telling stories like David's. Stories that remind you you're not alone in the wilderness. Thank you for walking with us. David's story didn't end in Ziklag. After the rescue, after the ashes, after the pain, came the fulfillment. Not long after, Saul fell in battle, and David was crowned king. But something had changed in him. He wasn't just a ruler now. He was a man who had faced despair and survived it. A man who knew what it was to lead when no one stood with him. A man who knew the voice of God even in silence. And perhaps that's what made him a man after God's own heart. Not his perfection, not his power, but his persistence, his refusal to let go of the God who had never let go of him. When you look at David's life, you see a pattern, not of ease, but of endurance. From the pasture to the palace, every step was shaped by surrender. Every fall, met by grace. Every silence, eventually filled by a song. Because David kept coming back. To God, to trust, to hope. And so can you. You don't have to have a crown to be called. You don't need a title to be anointed. You don't need perfect faith to be held by perfect love. You just need to get up one more time than you fall. Strengthen yourself in the Lord. And keep going. Because your Ziklag is not the end. It's the turning point. And the day you almost gave up may just be the day heaven was about to break through. Long before David ever stood before a throne, he stood alone in fields no one saw. That was the training ground, not for his hands, but for his heart. It was in the solitude of the hills that David learned what many never do. That leadership begins in loneliness. That before God gives influence, he often tests our integrity. The wilderness wasn't punishment, it was preparation. The moments we often ask God to remove are the very places he forms our calling. When David sat among sheep, he wasn't just learning to lead animals, he was learning to care for a people. To protect the weak, to confront danger, to worship in obscurity. Most of us don't see it when we're in it. We think we're being overlooked, forgotten, delayed. But God doesn't waste seasons. The pasture was building a king, one song, one prayer, one battle at a time. And when David faced Goliath, he didn't hesitate, not because he was the strongest or tallest, but because he had history with God. He had fought the lion and the bear, and he knew, not hoped, but knew, that the same God who had delivered him before would not fail him now. The courage to face giants doesn't come in a moment. It's built over years of obedience in small places. But even with that faith, David's journey was marked by suffering. After Goliath fell, David was celebrated, he was honored, he was invited into the palace. And for a brief moment, it seemed the prophecy was coming to pass. Then everything changed. Saul's jealousy turned to rage. And David, once the hero, became the hunted. He fled with nothing. No army, no wealth, no throne. Just a promise. It's hard to hold on to promises when everything around you contradicts them. When David wandered from cave to cave, hiding from a king he never tried to harm, he wrote some of his most honest psalms. In them, we see not the confidence of a warrior, but the cries of a wounded soul. Why are you downcast, O my soul? Why so disturbed within me? Have you forgotten me, O God? These weren't polished prayers. They were raw, real, yet even in the darkness, David kept talking to God. He kept writing. He kept trusting. This is what set him apart. Not his perfection, but his pursuit. When others would have cursed God, David clung to him. When others would have grown bitter, David remained broken, but open. He taught us that faith isn't pretending you're not hurt. It's choosing to believe even when you are. He could have taken Saul's life, twice. He could have forced the crown. But David refused. Because the throne wasn't just about power. It was about timing. And he trusted God to open the door when the time was right. When Ziklag burned and his men turned on him, it was the culmination of years of pain. Years of waiting. Years of feeling like God was silent. But David had learned a lesson in the fields, that God's silence is never absence. It's formation. And so he turned again to the Lord. He strengthened himself. He asked for direction, and he obeyed. Every great calling will face a day like Ziklag, a day when everything collapses. And quitting seems easier than continuing. What matters is what we do in that moment. Will we retreat, or rise? Will we doubt, or draw near? David chose to rise, to trust, to pursue, and God honored it. The rescue of Ziklag wasn't just the recovery of people, it was the recovery of purpose. David's leadership was forged not in victory, but in vulnerability, because the making of a king is not in his crown, but in his character. Let's save and check length so far. When David finally became king, he didn't enter the palace as a man untouched by hardship. He walked in as a survivor, a worshiper, a man with scars and songs, each one telling a story of how God carried him through. And yet, even as king, David's life wasn't perfect. He fell. He failed. There was Bathsheba, a decision that cost him dearly. There was the betrayal of his own son Absalom. There were wars, losses, regrets. But David never stopped returning. He kept coming back to the God of his youth, to the fields where it all began. In Psalm chapter 51, after one of his worst moments, David doesn't try to justify his actions. He doesn't blame. He doesn't hide. He simply prays. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. That's the heartbeat of a man who hasn't given up, not on God, not on himself. David shows us that the road to greatness isn't paved in perfection, but in repentance. Every time he stumbled, he came back, and every time he returned, God restored. There's something sacred about a soul that won't let go, about a heart that, no matter how broken, keeps turning toward its Creator. Maybe that's you today. Maybe you're in a place where promises feel far away, where your Ziklag moment is burning all around you. Maybe you've been anointed, but not yet appointed, called, but not yet crowned. And maybe, just maybe, you're tired. Let David's story be your reminder. You're not forgotten. You're not disqualified. You're not done. God is still writing, still shaping, still leading you, even through the pain. If you find yourself in a cave, or staring at ashes, or wondering if you missed your chance, look again. God's not finished. He who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. You just have to do what David did. Fall forward. Pray again. Believe again. Sing, even if your voice shakes. And keep walking. Because the same God who stood with David, in fields, in caves, in battle, in failure, is the God who stands with you now. So don't give up. Not today. Not yet. Not when breakthrough might be one prayer away. Let's check the character count again. David's journey wasn't a straight line. It was a spiral, always circling back to God, but through deeper valleys and higher mountains. And yet, with every turn, he grew. As a young shepherd, he defended sheep with a sling. As a seasoned king, he defended a nation with wisdom. But in both places, whether with stones or strategies, his source of strength remained the same: the Lord. It's easy to admire David's victories, to picture him slaying giants, dancing before the ark, writing timeless songs. But perhaps the most powerful parts of his story aren't the triumphs, but the tears. When he wept for his son, when he fasted and prayed, and still didn't get the answer he hoped for, when he cried out from the depth of despair, and wrote words like, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Those same words Jesus would later echo on the cross. Because David's story points forward. It's not just about a king, but a coming king. Jesus, the son of David, would walk a path even darker. He too would be anointed, yet rejected. He too would be betrayed by those close to him. He too would weep, would be hunted, would be crowned, but not with gold, with thorns. David's Psalms gave language to suffering. Jesus gave it redemption. And that's the thread through it all. From the shepherd to the cross to your life today. Redemption. Maybe you feel like your best days are behind you. Maybe your mistakes feel too great. Maybe the fire of Ziklag has left more ash than hope. But hear this. God doesn't abandon his children in the wilderness. He meets them there. He speaks in the silence. He restores what was lost. David recovered everything, not just physically, but spiritually. He came back stronger, more humble, more aware of his need for God. And so can you. The path forward won't always be clear. It may twist and turn. But with every step, God is present. In your battles, he is your shield. In your waiting, he is your strength. In your tears, he is your comfort. And in your silence, he is still speaking. So take heart. If today feels like the day you want to give up, know this. You're in the company of kings. You're not weak for wanting to quit. You're strong for still standing. Let the story of David be more than history. Let it be hope, a reminder that you don't have to be perfect to be chosen. You just have to stay close to the one who chose you. Let's check total characters now. The day David almost gave up could have been the end of the story. But instead, it became the beginning of something greater. Because on that day, David discovered a truth that every soul must one day face. That strength is not the absence of pain, but the presence of purpose in the midst of it. When all else is stripped away, when friends fail, when plans crumble, when prayers feel unanswered, what remains? Your choice. To keep believing, to keep hoping, to keep trusting. That's what David did. He chose to strengthen himself in the Lord, not in what he had, not in who surrounded him, but in who called him. And that decision changed everything. It restored his courage. It renewed his direction. It reminded him that the story wasn't over. And that's what I want you to hold on to. Your story is not over. The ashes of today could be the soil for tomorrow's calling. The pain of this moment could be preparing you for something far greater than you imagined. You might not see it yet. You might not feel it. But if you'll lean in, if you'll anchor your heart again in the God who formed it, you'll find strength rising where fear once ruled. That's the legacy of David. Not just a king, but a man who kept showing up, kept repenting, kept believing, and in the end, it wasn't his throne that made him great. It was his heart. And that same God, the one who saw David in the field, in the cave, in the fire, sees you. He sees your faith, even when it's fragile. He hears your prayers, even when they're whispered. And he walks with you, even when you feel alone. So don't give up. Your Ziklag moment may be painful, but it's not final. Strengthen yourself in the Lord, and move forward. Because the day you almost gave up may very well be the day your purpose is reborn. And years from now, when you look back, it won't be the palace you remember most. It will be the moment in the wilderness when you chose to trust again. And everything began to change. Let's now save the complete script to file. Because the deepest transformations are not born in celebration but in crisis. David's journey is not just a testimony of faith. It is a mirror for every believer who finds themselves wandering through disappointment. For every calling that feels delayed. For every heart that cries out, "How long, O Lord?" Sometimes the most anointed are also the most afflicted. Because God doesn't rush the ones he loves. He refines them. David didn't ascend quickly because the throne was too important to place into untested hands. And so God allowed the wilderness. Not to punish him, but to prepare him. And that same God may be allowing your delay. Not to discourage you, but to deepen you. He's not ignoring your tears. He's collecting them. He's not blind to your questions. He's patient with them. Because every ache you carry becomes a prayer, a sacred echo from your soul to his. The scriptures tell us that David was a man after God's own heart. But look closer, and you'll see why. Not because he never fell, but because he never stayed down. Not because he had perfect obedience, but because he had persistent repentance. Not because he was always strong, but because in his weakness, he kept returning to the source. We are not remembered in eternity by our titles or our triumphs, but by our trust. And David trusted, even when it hurt, even when it cost him everything, even when the silence stretched long. He never stopped returning. He never stopped singing. And in his final days, as he passed the baton to Solomon, he didn't boast about battles or conquests. He told his son to follow God, to know him, to walk in his ways. Because David had learned that crowns can fall, kingdoms can fade, but a life anchored in God, that lasts forever. You are not behind. You are not forgotten. And if today you are standing on the edge, wondering if you have what it takes to keep going, let the life of David whisper back to you across the centuries. You were made for this. Not by your strength, but by his Spirit. So rise, sing, and walk on. For the Lord who carried David will carry you too. Every step of the way. Even here, even now, especially now. There's a quiet kind of faith that doesn't always get noticed. It's the kind that wakes up after crying through the night, and still chooses to pray. The kind that keeps doing the right thing when no one applauds. The kind that loves deeply, even when love isn't returned. This is the kind of faith that David lived. A rugged, real, resilient trust that clung to God not for what he gave, but for who he was. And that's the kind of faith that changes the world. You may never sit on a throne. You may never lead an army or write a song. But you can choose, like David, to strengthen yourself in the Lord, to worship when it's hard, to forgive when it hurts, to wait when it's long, to rise when it feels easier to quit. And in doing so, you become a testimony, not just of what God can do, but of what he can carry us through. Let the day you almost gave up become your monument of mercy. A marker in time that says, here is where I almost turned back, but God gave me the strength to go on. And when others are walking through their Ziklag moments, they'll look to your story and find hope. Because of your endurance, because of your honesty, because you didn't quit. So here you are, still breathing, still trying, still believing, even if it's just with a mustard seed of faith. And that is more than enough. Because God doesn't need perfection to perform miracles. He only needs your yes. One more day, one more prayer, one more step. Just like David, and just like David, you'll find that on the other side of the silence is a song only your journey could write. Let's now finalize and save this extended version. So don't let this be the day you give up. Let it be the day you remember why you started. The day you remember who called you. The day you choose, again, to trust. And someday, you'll look back and realize, this wasn't the end, it was the beginning of your becoming. And that is where the story truly begins, not in the moment of strength, but in the choice to keep walking through the weakness.